we've got a control center here that is...
It's one of the ICE detention centers now at the heart of an emergency lawsuit. Detainees and activists alleging the men and women inside are in grave danger of potential coronavirus exposure. Protesters are taking notice, calling on ICE to release those who are at risk of coronavirus complications. But inside these walls, we were the first camera crew ICE admitted back in October to see this facility in Farmville, Virginia.
These are two of the negative pressure rooms that I mentioned.
We asked Director Jeff Crawford specifically about an outbreak of mumps in June 2019, an incident that activists say wasn't handled properly.
There were reports that there was a mumps outbreak here earlier in the year.
Correct.
There were also reports that vaccinations were not immediately offered. Can you respond to that?
Sure. When we have an incident like that, we work with the local health department and we take the directives from them as far as what to do. It took us about a week, I believe, to get the mumps vaccinations ordered.
ICE told us in a statement efforts to identify individuals who may be at a higher risk for severe illness as a result of COVID-19 are ongoing, and there are no reported cases in Farmville. But there are 2 cases reported in ICE's other facility just north of Richmond. And as for that lawsuit, well, right now it's in the hands of a federal judge in Alexandria. In Northwest, Mike Valerio, WUSA 9.